Hello. Mhm. A doctoral student in semiotics and cultural studies at the University of Tartu in Tallinn, Estonia. His research interests include intra and interspecies communication, ethology, language evolution, and human influence upon non-human animal science systems and cognition. He's going to talk today about zoosemiotics in general, and more specific about his research into ape-human communication. In case you need Mirko to clarify anything during his talk, please ask a question in the chat. And alternatively, you can keep your questions for the discussion at the end of the talk. So, Mirko, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well. Great. So I will share my screen with you so that you have a easier time following. And here you should be able to see some slides now. So I thought about just briefly talking to you about zoosemiotics, define it and clarify what is the research object of a zoosemiotic research and what methodologies are usually used in a zoosemiotics research. And then I will move on to more specifically talk about my own research project that is the study of human-ape relationships in hybrid environments, more specifically zoos. And to do that, I will introduce an author that has been of a very great influence on my work, that is Jakob von Uexküll. And the last part of my talk will be on human-animal interactions and interspecies relations. And then I will conclude with a case study in Tallinn Zoological Gardens, where I tried to figure out how different relationships and human attitudes towards different species have an influence on animal handling and the lives of animals in the zoo, and what role basically do animals in the zoo play in shaping their own life and routines. So to begin, a very easy, obvious question: what is zoosemiotics? And to do that, first we should define what is semiotics. This is not very easy because it depends on the researcher you ask. But the way I understand the semiotics, the way I refer to semiotics is as the study of meaning and theory of science, and basically the disciplines that is involved with this, with the understanding of how meaning is created. So if we define semiotics as that, zoosemiotics instead can be defined and as the study of signification, communication, and representation within and across animal species. Or more simply, is the semiotic study of animals, which includes the way animals create meaning, generate meanings, but also includes aspects that are more related to humanities in a sense. For example, how animals appear in human cultural products, how they are used, for example, in texts, in literature, or movies, in culture, and so on. So we can say that zoosemiotics is the discipline that, in a sense, is at the border of humanities and natural science. More specifically, zoology and ethology. There are different objects of research that the zoosemiotic topic can cover. Some of these are, for example, the study of animals in houses, in human household. That includes pets, most obviously. But one neglected aspect maybe is the fact that actually we do not share house only with pets, but there are so many species that live in our homes without we even realizing actually. And this also includes the study of relationships, for example, of animals and humans in the city. So it also includes what we usually define wild animals. Another topic of interest would be the study of animals and human relations in zoos and natural parks, or simply the study of how animals interact and live their lives in zoos. And this is specifically what I'm interested in. And other aspects include, for example, representation of animals in culture. So as I mentioned, movies or literature, and all sorts of human texts, and non-verbal communication in humans. It seems almost obvious to say that we as animals have aspects that can be studied through a zoosemiotics lens. Although I understand that from different fields, this might be not always favorable, because humans tend to be human products tend to be studied with different methodology in other fields. But in zoosemiotics, it is common to study non-verbal communication in humans as well. And finally, animal communication and ecology, that is relationships of animals with their own environments, and communication issues related to other animals, or human and animals. Some basic principles. So zoosemiotics is a transdisciplinary discipline. So that means that it takes and it borrows terminology and methodologies of other various fields. This is a strength of a semiotic approach in general, because it allows, in the case of semiotics, to deal with topics that are both of interest for, let's say, classic disciplines that deal with animals, such as zoology or biology and so on, so hard sciences, we can say. But it also includes elements that are more, let's say, traditionally dealt within a humanitarian, humanistic approach, because we are also dealing most commonly with aspects that are related to humans. So this is, I would say, it's one of the strengths of semiotics. So borrowing terminology and zoosemiotics as well, borrowing terminology and methodologies of other disciplines, elaborating on it, and bringing, let's say, a semiotic oriented approach to other disciplines. So it oftentimes it expands on previous research. One basic principle of semiotic, though, that distinguishes from other fields, and this is, in my opinion, most often in opposition with other humanist disciplines in the humanities, animals are treated as subjects, not only object of research. So the focus is not only how animals are used by humans, for example, but the way animals shape their own relationships with humans. And for example, if we take an analysis of the role of animals in literature, what a zoosemiotic would be, how a zoosemiotic would be different, a zoosemiotic approach would be different, is that we would pose attention on the way that the animals itself, via his or her own biological features, influences and has an impact upon human understanding of such animal, and so on. while we make use oftentimes in zoosemiotics of quantitative data coming from zoobiology, for example, or biology and so on, the preferred research object, research methodology is of a qualitative kind, because the issues that are dealt within zoosemiotics oftentimes require sort of answers that are why or how this is happening, that quantitative data not often manage to answer fully. And approaches usually tend to be comparative, because we tend to look into the communicative abilities of different species and compare them. And I would say that zoosemiotics is characterized by a holistic approach that treats biological organisms as unique. And each species, each individual, I would even say, lives in his own subjective world that needs to be accessed somehow. And one way to access it is through the use of the Umwelt model. As a matter of fact, the subjective worlds of the organisms are often known as simply as Umwelt. Now, I'm not sure if you have ever heard of the term Umwelt, but if you speak German, usually it is translated as environment. But the concept is much broader than a mere understanding of environment as a physical entity. And I will explain to you as successfully as I can what we mean by Umwelt in biosemiotics and zoosemiotics. And the concept, first of all, has been developed by Jakob von Uexküll, who was a Baltic German biologist. And he, I would say he's one of the most influential figures in biosemiotics and in contemporary biosemiotics. And he was a Baltic German biologist who was actually born here in Estonia. And he enrolled at the University of Tartu in 1889, where he graduated, and his interest was most specifically in physiology. And after his graduation, he spent his time in different zoological stations in Europe, among which Naples in Italy and Heidelberg in Germany, where he developed his interest in neuromuscular physiology. He's also known for having established a very important center in 1926, known as in English as the Institute for Environmental Research in Hamburg, which was a center that brought together different personalities at the time that were interested in zoology, physiology, among people who visited the place, for example, Konrad Lorenz and all other influential figures of the beginning of the 20th century in biology and zoology, as I mentioned. But beyond his biography, what is most well known for is for having developed the concept of Umwelt, which we can define as the subjective world of an organism that is constructed through the perceiving organs and effector or action, let's say, organs of an organism. In a semiotic sense, the Umwelt can be understood as a qualitative and meaningful model of a species significant surrounding, so of the physical environment. Now, when we speak about Umwelt, what we need to take into account first is that we understand the environment not as a static entity that is just there, we live in it and we all share it. The environment from a semiotic and zoosemiotics perspective is tied to the subjective construction of each organism, and it is in a sense a subjective world. Each species has certain perceptive organs and action organs, and through these organs, the world is constructed and acquires meaning. So what we need to do when, if we want to use a zoosemiotics approach, is to forget about the idea of environment as a universal entity in a sense. And so the Umwelt can be understood as the semiotic world of an organism. So this subjective word that I was talking about, that is self-contained and unique to each species. The Umwelt is constructed through what Uexküll called the functional circle. Sometimes you can find it as translated as the functional cycle. And here you have a representation on the screen. It's just a model of it, let's say. And I will try to explain it with a very classic example, that is that of the tick that you can see here on the bottom of the screen. So first of all, the functional cycle is can be understood as a basic model of semiosis, so how things become meaningful for a subject. And so as I was mentioning earlier already, a subject has some sense organs and some effector organs. And the subject, or any animal basically, picks some features from the environment or of an object, and then acts upon it or modifies the object through his actions. Now, you have probably encountered ticks in your life, or you at least have you're familiar with them. So these are some small organisms then that in summer are quite active, and they feed on blood of other animals, most commonly mammals. Now, if you think about a tick, you might, and if you consider already what I told about the way that the environment should not be understood as a static thing, you might imagine how much different the world of a tick is compared to a human. We can say that the Umwelt of a tick is composed of a very few meaningful elements. First of all, a tick is blind and is deaf. The tick does not possess eyes, and it just has some sense organs that help the tick to sense the sunlight, but these sense organs are throughout the skin, so there aren't very specific eyes. So the eyeless animals climbs on a tree or a blade of grass, sensing the light of the sun through the skin, and will wait there for a prey. Now, the only stimulus that a tick is now responsive to is the smell of butyric acid, which is a compound that it comes from mammals' follicles. And for the tick, this compound acts as a sign that means a prey is present. And once this butyric acid is smelled, the tick will fall blindly towards the prey. If it senses something warm, then it probably means that it was successful, and it will look for the spot with less hair to start sucking blood of the victim. However, if it does not perceive warmth, it will climb back up and the cycle will start all over again. This is a very classic example, a very simple one to speak about the functional cycle. So there is a perception aspect that is the butyric acid, and an effector or action part that will be the falling down from the tree and going on the animal to suck blood. As you can understand from my words, then the word of a tick is much simpler than that of a human, obviously. And while they do not possess the vision range that we have, for example, they still can act in their own environment and find what they need through their own perceptive organs and change the environment through their own actions. Now, the tick is the most classic example because it was the one that Uexküll gave. But when we talk about complex animals, we should bear in mind that things get more complicated because more functional cycles will happen simultaneously. So things will not be so easy as for the tick. So one of the core principles of the Umbel theory is that what distinguishes the living from the non-living is meaning. So all living creatures create and use, in a sense, meaning. And reality is subjective. Therefore, we cannot speak of objective reality, especially if we are considering other species. And animals should not be treated as machines, but as subjects who make their own choices to an extent. They have their own perception of things that are obviously much different from the way we perceive the world. And our goal as researchers should be to reconstruct the world of other species. And one way to do it is indeed to use the Umwelt model, and therefore to study the biological construction of species and pair it with behavioral analysis so that we can get an approximate, in a sense, insight within the world of other living beings. Of course, this will never be an exact replica, let's say, of the world of other species, because we cannot directly access it. And it will always be a human reconstruction of the world of other animals. So this is something that we do take into account, and it is something that we do acknowledge. So the Umwelt model, therefore, it's not perfect, obviously, but it allows to abandon, in a sense, what we might consider strongly anthropocentric and anthropomorphic interpretation of the world of other species. I hope everything is clear as for now. If you have any question, you can, of course, ask me. Because now I would like to instead move on to the unfortunately, I'm not able to see the chat here. So if you have asked me any questions and I haven't answered, please feel free to turn your microphone on and just ask, because while I'm sharing the screen, I cannot access here. So one of my research interest is concerned with the study of human and animal interactions in hybrid environments. And by hybrid environments, I mean all those environments where humans and animals interact to an extent. And one classic example of a hybrid environment is a zoological garden. A zoological garden is a place where humans and animals interact daily, and animals interact with different kinds of humans that range from unfamiliar, such as visitor, to familiar faces like keepers. And what we need to consider when studying zoological gardens is that not only meaning generation, human meaning generation needs to be considered, but obviously we are dealing here with very many species, and as such there is a variety of sign relations that need to be considered and make zoological gardens quite complex, because from one extent we might consider intraspecies relations, so relations between the same member of a species. On the other extent, we might consider interspecies relations, for example, between animals of different species or humans and other animals, because obviously we are also of a different species. So this is why zoological gardens are quite complex semiotic environments. The study of human-animal relationships in zoological garden, it's not something exclusive to zoosemiotics, but it is focus of zoobiology as well. That is the discipline that deals with the study of animals in a captive environment through usually through a quantitative approach. And several studies have been conducted, for example, to understand what is the role of visitors on the behavior and psychological state of animals. So, for example, do visitors impact negatively the welfare of animals, and how to mitigate, in a sense, negative impacts. Generally, studies have concluded that most of the interaction between visitors and animals is has a negative impact. Many species are quite get quite stressed by huge amount of people in front of their enclosure, looking and shouting and so on. So you can imagine how stressful it can be. But the situation is not so clear-cut. Many scholars, as a matter of fact, have suggested that humans might be a source of enrichment for animals because they sort of provide a novelty, some stimuli that otherwise will be lacking in a captive environment, because, you know, everything is sort of static there. And humans, being some sort of changing aspect, bring some novelty that might make animal more active. As a matter of fact, there are inconclusive results. Many species, while many species seem to be impacted negatively, some others are not impacted at all. Some other species seem to thrive on human interactions, and even within each species there is a level of individuality that needs to be considered. Some gorilla species, some gorillas, for example, individual gorillas have been known to be seeking human interactions with visitors. They would go close to the glass, for example, and interact in a way or another. But some other gorillas, for example, will not want to interact. They will go away if they see humans and stuff like this. So it really needs to be established also on an individual level. What's lacking, though, in previous research is the study of human and keepers, sorry, not human, but animal and keepers interactions, which surprisingly is something that previous research has sort of neglected. There are a few studies, for example, that shows positive interactions between big cats and keepers translate in improved welfare for animals. Other studies have highlighted that chimpanzees and humans increased interactions translate in increased grooming activity and reduced inactivity. So it would seem that it's positive. But as I mentioned earlier, animals interact with different types of people, and these interactions are also regulated by zoos, so by zoo standards and by some guidelines, which are known as contact policies. These contact policies are something that zoo adopt to make sure that from one side, animals will be not excessively stressed by human interactions, and at the same time, these guidelines make sure that humans, visitors and keepers will be safe from animals' attack. There are different types of contact policies that you can find in a zoo that range from a free contact policy, where animals and keepers can interact to a unlimited extent. There is no space barrier between keepers and animals. So what it means is that a keeper can enter the enclosure of the animal with no separation, and any sort of contact can and might happen. On the other hand, though, we have protected contact policies where physical barriers are used to protect keepers from animals. Physical contact is still allowed, but this only can happen through barriers. This is usually used with animals that are they're quite big, for example, like a rhino or an elephant, but that won't bite your hand off, so you can still somehow pet them if they are in a positive state, obviously. But because they can pose a threat to the well-being of keepers, free contact is not advised. I have to say, though, that this contact policy change and have changed during the history of zoos. For example, elephants before with elephants before free contact policies was happening. And as a matter of fact, before this changed, in America at least, the elephant keepers was one of the most dangerous jobs that caused more deaths than coal miners. So it was obviously something that should have been fixed, and nowadays free contact, at least in European and American zoos, is not happening anymore with elephants. And finally, we have a zero contact policy that is, as the name suggests, a contact policy that does not allow any type of contact with the animals, not even through barriers. And this type of contact is used with the most dangerous animals, for example, crocodiles or alligators, because they are quite fast at attacking. Even a barrier will not suffice, so no contact is allowed between keepers and animals. This contact policies also apply for visitors, but there are obviously some differences. Free contact policy is not very common with visitors because they're not allowed to enter the enclosure. But at the same time, you might find places where free contact is used, for example, petting zoos, or some zoos where some species actually roam freely, the zoo grounds, basically. As for apes, that is the focus of my research, most commonly the type of contact that is used, as you can imagine, is protected contact, sometimes zero contact. Adult apes are considered hazardous animals, dangerous animals, and no free contact is allowed. A chimpanzee is 6 times stronger than a human, so you can imagine that it's better not to interact too freely with them. But why I'm talking about the contact policy is that when considering relationships between humans and animals, therefore, we need to consider cultural elements or, in a sense, regulations. But we also need to consider the animal point of view, the animal side. Therefore, how much physical contact is needed, is necessary, and is advised to have with an animal. So my research, as a matter of fact, focuses on how animals and humans construct meanings within hybrid environments, and how species-specific science systems are mutually changed through social interactions. So one side to consider, therefore, is the contact policies, but the other side is also to consider interspecies communication and how much social touch, for example, is important for animals and humans alike. If we take apes, physical touch and social touch is social touch and physical contact is one of the most commonly used means of communication. You know that apes are, they spend a lot of time grooming each other. Grooming is not only something used to clean one's own fur, but it has a very strong social meaning. Grooming is used to strengthen social bonds between apes. It has been observed that grooming is used sort of as a currency for favors within the group and to increase alliances between members. Grooming is also used to mitigate negative interactions. So in stressful situations, grooming has been observed. It has been observed that grooming increases to reduce stress within the group. And tactile comfort is something that is very common to all primate species, but it is actually not only something that is common in primates. It can be found in many other mammalian species, and as a matter of fact, in some birds, in bird species as well. So keeping in mind that social touch is of vital importance for apes, then we need to question the type of how the regulations of physical contact impacts human-animal relationships and specifically ape-keeper relationships. Body contact with different staff members, as a matter of fact, seems to have a positive effect on animals and keepers alike, because it allows both parties to establish close connections and to strengthen their own social bond. As a matter of fact, grooming from staff members has been also used in some studies to allow some orphan apes to be then socially integrated with other members of the group, in the case the mother is not present. And grooming can be used, as I mentioned, to release stress. And one thing that needs to be considered though here is how does grooming coming from a human impact the interactions of the ape with the other animals. The reason is that grooming is passed from mother to offspring, grooming style. So the way an ape grooms is, in a sense, socially passed. And this has an impact within the group dynamics, because different members then will, in a sense, react differently to different grooming styles. And the way that apes groom is not the way that a human would groom. Apes' hands are much different from ours, and the way they groom is actually, from a human perspective, quite painful. And it includes also picking of body hair and something that we might consider as pinching, rather. In a sense, what has not been studied is how the grooming coming from a human might influence the relationship of the ape with the other apes. However, there are some studies that do suggest that human touch can be used to facilitate integration, and can be used especially in those situations I mentioned where there is no other way for the ape to get the grooming that they require. Primates spend up to 10% of their daily life to grooming other members. That depends obviously on the species and on the specific ape, but the only ape that does not spend as much time grooming the other is the orangutan, just because they are more less sociable than the others. They spend most of the time alone, so not in big groups like chimpanzees. But if we consider keepers as vital keys to positive changes in the life of the apes in captive environments, then one of my hypothesis was that humans can be, and keepers in specific, can be considered as social companions for apes. And the word companion is something that comes from the work of Konrad Lorenz, and can be defined as a fellow, or somebody that basically does a kind of activity with you, such as hunting or drinking, from German. So it should not be confused with the word friendship or friends, which has a more emotional, let's say, and psychological level. This is more about roles that each person or animal plays within the group. But if we consider keepers as social companions of apes, then we should reevaluate the dynamics of keepers and animals, and we should start considering keepers as, in a sense, some sort of extended group members for apes. And as a matter of fact, they are able to supplement emotional and cognitive stimulation for animals. And they have had, as I mentioned, some impact on enrichment for apes. But this doesn't come with downsides, because in many cases, animals that get too attached to specific keepers might go through withdrawal syndromes. In the case, keepers will be suddenly disappearing. For example, they change a job or they die. And elephants in specifically have been are known to construct very strong emotional bonds with their keepers, which oftentimes had negative impacts when the keepers had to move jobs, because they will not want to adjust to new people, and they will, in a sense, have a negative association with new keepers, and they will suffer from the disappearance of their usual keeper, in a sense. So this is also something that should be considered. So if we take again what I've said, from one side we need to consider cultural understanding of animals and zoo regulations. From the other side, we also need to consider the other animal side. Therefore, how important is physical touch or interaction, social interaction, just simply for this animal species in question. And why we should do that is that by reevaluating this, the role of keepers with and their influence on enrichment and welfare of animals, captive animals, then we have a chance to better the welfare of animals in captivity. Of course, obviously, when we speak about social animals in particular, we should also consider, or higher animals, so-called, we should always consider individual level preferences. What is true for one individual, it's not true for another. This is true for humans, but it's also true for animals. If you have had pets, you know how every pet is different from the other. And even though there might be similarities that are species specific, there is always a history of individuality that needs to be considered. Now, do you have any questions about anything I've talked about until now? Okay, so we might just take some time later on, because now I would like to move to the last part of my research, rather last part of my talk, and one of the parts of my research that was the understanding of how human attitudes towards different animal species impact their relationships with the animals, and how these in turn impact the lives of animals within zoos. So if on one side we have the animal species-specific characteristic to be considered, on the other side we also have the human attitudes towards different species. If you ever look at the logos of zoos, most commonly you will find a couple of similar animal species being represented, which are often known as the charismatic megafauna. And those animal species are oftentimes big animals, mammalian species, and they are social species most of the time. So most commonly you will find lions, you will find tigers, you will find elephants, and you will find apes. So all these classic animals that that humans love to love. And there are some reasons why this is done. Because the previous research as a matter of fact highlighted that humans tend to react towards different species differently, and we tend to prefer those species whose body size is larger than ours, or roughly as big as ours. We tend to prefer species that are visually flashy, colorful. We tend to prefer species that are vocal and very social. So this excludes a lot of species that instead are either not considered as important or even hated. This includes animals such as species that belong to the taxonomic group of insects, for example, or fish as well are not most commonly used in logos, for example, or not used in, not as beloved. And reptiles are also some of the species that people don't really tend to like. Although within these groups, there are obviously individual differences, and there are still strong differences if we consider different species. Among reptiles, for example, people tend to like turtles, and among insects, people tend to like butterflies or bees. And the reason why they like bees is most commonly because it's economically good for us to have bees around. And in the case of mammals, though, even here we can find some differences. People don't like a lot, they don't tend to like rats or mice. And this has to do also with, especially in Europe, with a history of association between rats and disease that comes from medieval times and so on. So there is a history that there is, in a sense, a cultural variation that also needs to be accounted for. The roots of different attitudes can therefore be found at the cultural and institutional level. So how animals are species are culturally perceived and managed in zoos, but it can also be found at the biosemiotic level. So if we have taken into consideration what I've just said about human attitude towards different species, we might also need to take into account that keepers as humans will have their own bias toward different species. And this bias will definitely have an impact, or supposedly have an impact on the animals they take care of. And I wanted to investigate this because I have not found previous studies that involved keepers. And to do that, I am lucky enough that in Tallinn Zoological Gardens, they have 3 chimpanzees and many other species. So to do that, I decided to conduct a qualitative study. Qualitative interviews were conducted with keepers in Tallinn Zoological Gardens to understand how individual animals influence handling practices within zoological gardens, and how human perceptions of animals influences handling. My study had a multi-species focus because I wanted to figure out whether these variables of size and species differences has an impact also from the point of view as a keeper, in a sense. And especially considering the fact that keepers, being the people that interact the most with animals, are the ones that have a more direct influence on the animal welfare and life within zoos. So to do that, I studied chimpanzees, Pygmy Marmosets, and saltwater crocodiles, which I will briefly now speak about. The choice is not casual. I tried to keep in mind the size variables and the species variables when picking the species that then I focused on. And the chimpanzees, they had 3 chimpanzees in Tallinn Zoo. Unfortunately, one of them passed away 2 years ago. And chimpanzees are the most representative species of great apes that is native of the African continent. And they share 99% of their DNA with us. So they're incredibly close from an evolutionary perspective. And as for the body size, they are roughly that of an adult human. They're a little shorter, but not much. And the other species that I studied was the Pygmy Marmoset. You can see it from the picture how tiny it is. It's as big as a hand. They are usually around 12 to 15 centimeters. In Tallinn Zoo, there were around 20 marmosets. I say around because unfortunately keepers were not able to say how many. and they are native of the New World, so the Americas, and they're found in the Amazon basin, and they are very sociable, as they are chimpanzees. And as for Pygmy Marmosets, they are really cute, which is one feature that seems to influence humans' preferences. And their cuteness is something very biological dictated in a sense. If you look at the face of marmosets, they have a very tiny nose, very tiny eyes, and they look fluffy. They look cuddly in a sense. And these are all features that people tend to prefer because they remind us of human babies in a sense, or at least this is the supposed idea. These features are common in human babies. So having a small nose and small eyes and a big head compared to the body usually. And their social structure is quite complex. They are involved in alloparental care, which means that members not related will take care of the babies of others if it's needed. So you even members that are not genetically close, they will take care of other babies, and they live in troops, usually of around 15 or 10 members, so around 20 more or less as well, depending on the group. And finally, we have the other animal that I took into account, a reptile, saltwater crocodile. This species is native of the Australian continent, and can also be found in the southern eastern region of Asia. And as the name suggests, lives in seawater, in the ocean. Is very big compared to the other species, around 6 meters. And I would say it's a very misunderstood species, and I will explain why I think so. And in Tallinn zoos, they have currently 2 crocodiles, saltwater crocodiles, Vanamees, which means in Estonian old man, and Lonni, and 1 male and a female. So I interviewed the keepers to understand how they understand animals and what type of relationship they believe they have built with the animals. So this is from the point of view of the person, of the keeper. Obviously, I did not conduct the study in a quantitative manner, so I cannot really say if the relationship that keepers have with the animals is mutual, but I will base my analysis on what the keepers told me. And from the analysis of data, I extracted 2 different themes, primary themes: the influence on handling by the animals, and what is the perception of human-animal bonds, keepers' perception of human-animal bonds. Each theme is then connected with some sub-themes. The animal influence on handling is connected to topic of animal agency and individuality of each animal. And keepers' perception of human-animal bonds instead is influenced by the overlap between subjective worlds or Umwelt, and by how predictable or unpredictable these animals are perceived to be. So as for the influence for the animal agency, which can be understood as the capacity of the animal to act with a goal, keepers understood agency in an almost quantifiable manner. Chimpanzees had the most agency, so they were given, in a sense, more freedom of choice and to act, while crocodiles were the animals that they perceived as having less agency within the zoo. And as for individuality, they were able to give precise descriptions of each personality of the chimps, but they were not able to give descriptions of any of the marmosets. They understood marmosets on a group level. Because there were so many, they lived in a big group and they were so tiny, they were not able to give specific descriptions of marmosets' individuality. Chimpanzees have an active role in shaping the work routine and social interactions within the zoo. They do that by making explicit requests. Such requests are done with gestures or sounds that keepers have associated to specific requests or meanings. And for example, chimpanzees in Italian zoos like to draw and paint, and they ask keepers to be given watercolors or crayons to do that. When I asked how they do that, they said that they will just do some gestures and they understand it. So that brings to the question of mutual understanding and shared meanings that comes from repeated social interactions. There is a sort of overlap between keepers and there is an overlap between keepers and chimpanzees' umwelt that allows collaboration to happen. For example, keepers told me that it would be almost impossible to conduct some of the tasks in the zoo without the explicit help of chimpanzees. And when asked why, they told me that chimpanzees help to close and open the doors. They help cleaning, they help fetching objects, and they do that even by their own accord. Sometimes they misuse this opportunity. They will pretend that they cannot close the gate because they don't want to go somewhere. That, for example, they will also put things in the wheels of the gate so that the gate will not close, and they will, in a sense, abuse their own helpfulness. They also told me that they are quite deceptive. They will pretend to be injured to receive special attention or treats. They will also get jealous of other members. If they have to give some medicines to the chimps, one of the chimps, they will have to give placebo to all the others, because otherwise they will get jealous because they're not receiving enough attention. As for marmosets, instead, as I was mentioning, the agency has granted a group level. They said that one of the keepers told me that marmosets think as a group, almost as a beehive sort of mentality. And the reason why they thought so is that they seem to have a very complex communication, interspecific communication, but they were not able to tell individual differences because there were too many. They all looked the same, that's what they told me, and they are too small to even see their facial expressions or understand what they want. But they do gain some individual preferences once some individual traits are acquired. For example, they can distinguish between marmosets' mothers. Keepers can distinguish between mothers, and they can distinguish members that are in isolation. So those marmosets have names. Otherwise, the marmosets in the group do not have names, which is not the case with chimpanzees, who all have their own individual name and individual history associated with it. They did think, though, that marmosets have individual preferences, individual level elements that they were not able to discern simply. And in that sense, momentary mood and individual preferences do not influence handling or work routines. Keepers will do what they need to do regardless of marmoset's state. So if they want to do it or not, they will not really care for that. While this is not the truth for chimpanzees, who are listened to in a sense, they are accommodated. If chimpanzees are not collaborative in that precise moment, keepers told me that they will move to different tasks and then come back and try again until they can do it. They told me that sometimes they will not clean the enclosure because chimpanzees are simply not collaborating that day. They don't want to be cleaned and they will have to do it another time. This is not true in the case of marmosets. And as for crocodiles, that was one of the most interesting discussions I had, because they were, while having individual names, unlike marmosets, they were not given any individual traits. So the male banamist and the female lonni did not have very specific individual characteristics. They were even described as living machines or living objects that need to be displayed in a museum, sort of way. So people come and watch the animals as they were machines, but they do not have any agency or internal dimensions. When I asked about preferences, they told me that they are basically war machines. They will just react to food and noises without making a difference between keepers or visitors and keepers. While this is not true in their opinion for chimpanzees, who distinguish between keepers and distinguish between keepers and visitors, obviously. And the fact that chimpanzees could distinguish between keepers also has an impact on the way the keepers work, because certain keepers have to fulfill certain tasks, because chimpanzees will allow only certain keepers to do that. So work tasks are, in a sense, decided by chimpanzees as well. While this is not true in the case of crocodiles. And while the two keepers did not associate them to machines, they did unconsciously associate the crocodiles to plants. They told me that among their tasks is to water plants at the zoo, and they told me that sometimes we water crocodiles, which was quite an interesting way to put it, in a sense. And so in conclusion, as I was mentioning, crocodiles are perceived as having no agency or no saying in what needs to be done in the zoo. So I'll try to finish fast. I want to talk about one concept that I try to develop, that is that of Umwelt overlap. Umwelt is usually understood as a subjective world that is species specific. So each species has its own Umwelt, that it is accessible only to that species. But one thing that is not taken into account is that many species actually have an overlapping reality that come from evolutionary history or repeated interactions. There are vast areas of shared meanings that need to be considered. These examples that I brought here, for example, are some concrete elements that could be considered as shared meanings in the case of chimpanzees that have an influence on handling and practices in the zoo. And this Umwelt overlap is also influenced by closer body structure. So that has to do with evolutionary reasons and how close we are to this species from a human point of view. Chimps are characterized by the highest degree of anthropomorphism because of that. They were granted higher mental capacities, which I would say human-like mental capacities, for example, deception. And this is also true because they are very sociable. Therefore, they will seek for interactions that allows keepers to build stronger connections with them. And as for marmosets, while they were very sociable, their living habits and body structure is completely different. Their vocal communication is very complicated. They actually are even have been observed to babble and to learn vocal communication, sort of like children do when they're young. But their pitches are quite high-thrilled, that sound like whining from our perspective. And that's what keepers actually told me, is that marmosets have a very emotional-like response to things, and they would sort of yell and be very excited in a sense. But this has to do with the way their own intraspecies communication works. They were granted higher cognition because of their sociability and social life within the group. But keepers did not feel they were part of the group themselves, while they did say that they felt they were part of the chimpanzees group. This is because they thought that marmosets need to live on their own. They need to learn how to be on with themselves, in a sense. And finally, crocodiles' Umwelt is completely different from the point of view of a human. They have an extremely different body structure. They are not as sociable, even though they are known to take care of their babies. They have very different living habits, being living in water most of their time, and they're also ectothermic animals, meaning that they do not generate they do not generate heating. They need to rely on external sources like the sun or heat lamps in zoos. This means that they spend most of their time still and under this lamp, which means that this is probably the reason why the keepers associate these animals with objects, because most of their day is spent in under a lamp without moving. They have a limited interaction with keepers because they do not eat as often. So even interactions that are in a sense forced would be limited. They eat every 2 weeks. So once they have eaten, they will be sort of just there. And they have very little interspecific social interactions, no facial expressions whatsoever, and almost no vocal communication, which in a sense aggravates this understanding of these animals as objects or machines. And finally, they are predictable from the point of view of keepers, because they will simply react to food in a predictable way, and no creativity in a sense is granted. And just to conclude, so Neotinic Effect is this cuteness factor that I was talking about. There was no report effect in my case on cuteness. So only thing that was told, one of the keepers told me that she thinks that the marmosets are like cute pets, while chimpanzees were associated to people and children, 5-year-old children by one keeper. And again, crocodiles to machines or objects. Anthropomorphism has definitely an influence on the way that keepers will interact with the animals. And in conclusion, I would say that body size and group size had an effect on keepers' understanding of their relationship with the animals. And all of this, I hope, will have an insight on how to utilize such ideas to better the animals, the welfare of animals in captive environments, and with a specific outlook on the recognition and subjective needs and preferences of keepers and animals, because I believe that by taking into account intraspecific and individual level elements, then the welfare of captive animals can be bettered. And in a sense, I also I try to shed light on the way that individual animals will have an impact on changes within zoo practices and zoo regulations. So let's say a bottom top level influence coming from the animal. And the zoosemiotics, I think, helped me into taking, or at least trying to take, an emic perspective into the lives of animals, without only considering the point of view of the humans, in a sense. And this will be it. And here you can find my publications if you're interested in reading more about it. And you can always write to me at my email as well, and I will be very happy to answer any of your questions now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mirko. Maybe you should, thank you, Mirko. This was really interesting. I think maybe you should stop sharing screen so that we can see each other.
Yes, true.
Okay. Getting better at this.
Yes.
Thank you for your wonderful talk. It was really interesting.
Thank you.
Now, anyone, if you have any questions for Mirko, now is the time.
Yes,
thank you very much for your very interesting lecture. I'm well aware about this Umwelt theory, and in zoosemiotic I use it in my research as well, connecting to Tim Ingold's ontological equivalent and dwelling theory. But my question is, because my theory is coming from zoofolkloristic and critical animal studies. And I think from my perspective, zoos are reinforcing human nature and human animal dichotomies and binary oppositions. What is your opinion about zoos in general?
I take zoos as entities that currently exist, and my goal is to better as much as I can with my research the conditions of the animals that are kept there. I think that zoos nowadays have definitely improved from previous have definitely improved from what they used to be, although there is a lot still to get better. And I think that it also depends on the country and the economic, in a sense, interest that each country puts into the zoo. I visited different zoos in Europe and also outside of Europe, and some zoos were just horrible. Some others were much better, and so unfortunately it's difficult to give a specific answer if I start considering all the individual zoos that I've seen. But as an entity, I do think that theoretically it has a very important role into conservation and education, more specifically. Although as for conservation, there are possibly better ways, such as nature conservation parks and in situ environments are definitely something that I would prefer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hi.
Hello.
Thank you, Mirko, very much for this, for your contribution and your stimulative talk, and for your wonderful slides that were uplifting with all the green colors. Thanks very much for that. And I had two questions, but now I think one would be more as a comment, because you answered it in the second half of your presentation. And I was just wondering about the role of material culture when it comes to the interaction of animals at the zoo and the keepers, and if they are not allowed direct contact, how is actually the social interaction achieved? But you gave a nice example with the chimpanzees and how, and I was thinking not only about food, obviously they're given food, but are they given any other, like objects, and how they interact via these objects with the humans, and the example of how different chimpanzees had to be given pills, because otherwise they would become agitated or something. That was a very nice example. But obviously it doesn't work with all species and all animals, as we have seen crocodiles would react just to food. But that's also a question, if do the keepers try to interact with them in another way, or it's just giving them food? Are they giving any other like stimuli through objects or something?
So keepers don't want to interact with crocodiles. They feel that, at least in my case, they feel that they are dangerous and they do not need interactions. Actually, that's what they told me. So the enrichment that comes for crocodiles is just a standard enrichment that has no, it has not been tailored to that specific crocodile. So for example, the enrichment strategies for crocodiles include different areas and heat lamps that are positioned differently and so on in some zoos, for example, so that the crocodile would have some things to do. And also food enrichment is quite common. But of course, crocodiles are not as sociable. So there is definitely a question here that I was trying to ask, but I do not have an answer for, is how to take away the human bias towards sociable species, and how to make sure that even those species that are not as sociable will get the type of enrichment that they need. Because most of the enrichment strategies that I discussed with chimpanzees, they are quite human-like, drawing, using toys. And this works quite well with primates because they're so close to us. But of course, a crocodile will not be drawing. And so this posed the question what to do with other species. And in the case of Tallinn Zoo, there was no specific strategy, to be honest, in the case of crocodiles. And this is not only for a case in Tallinn Zoo, it's quite common in other zoos as well. Because we have a very narrow understanding of what will be enriching from our own perspective as well.
That's true. Yes, that's true. Thank you very much. And my other question is, you mentioned some studies talking about how, for example, elephants create strong emotional bonds with their keepers. But have you come across any studies about the keepers perhaps creating strong emotional bonds with the animals they look after, and how does that affect their lives?
So it's quite a paradox that keeper animals studies are lacking, because you would expect that it's one of the first things that a researcher should look into. But there is a very surprisingly lack of research. But there are some studies that suggest that positive bonds between animals and keepers will improve the welfare of animals and the welfare of the person working there, which is also something that needs to be considered. So, for example, in the case of Tallinn Zoos, one of the keepers that I worked with, she had worked for many years with elephants before she moved to work with working with chimpanzees. And she was she's very every time I talked to her, she was very, very excited when talking about elephants and chimpanzees, and much less interested in talking about crocodiles or other species, to an extent that she was almost annoyed when I was asking about the other species. And that is because she feels that she has constructed very strong bonds with the chimpanzees, especially the male who passed away. And she told me, I've heard, actually, I didn't talk directly to her, but I heard that she was very saddened by the fact that the chimp had passed away as well. So there is obviously there is a human perspective and animal perspective that need to be considered both in this case. Yeah, I hope I answered your question. Sorry.
Yes, yeah, great. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Any more questions?
May I?
Okay.
May I?
Yes.
Susanna, hello.
Dear Marko, thank you very much for a stunning lecture. Related to your first part of the presentation, I'm interested in how the doctoral study on semiotics at the University of Tartu is organized, and what is the part of the role of zoosemiotics in the study, because I'm not sure Professor Branka is with us here. I'm not sure in which part the zoosemiotics has on the university, for example, at the university at Zagreb.
Okay, so because Uexküll was Baltic German, and he lived here in Tartu. There is a strong tradition that has to do with zoosemiotics here, and I would say that it is one of the strongest in the world. And we have already in the bachelor's program courses devoted to zoosemiotics, and then they continue with the master's program, and there is obviously an opportunity to continue with it with a PhD. Here in Tartu we have 3 different branches of semiotics that are equally represented, which is cultural semiotics, zoosemiotics or biosemiotics in general, and social semiotics. So all 3 branches have equal parts in the master's program, and then the PhD program, well, that depends on the PhD student and their own interest. But I would say that it has a very strong role here in Tartu. And yes, please.
Well, may
Yeah.
I?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. First of all, thank you so much. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here, to be able, because this is one of my, one of the few lectures I've had on something that's not within linguistics, since I come from the linguistics. But then my topic that I was in is related to animals, and that's the path I had to your lecture actually. But then again, to the question you had, the last question you had on the tradition on semiotics. Well, yes, due to the Lotman and the Lotman tradition and the Estonian, I mean, Tallinn tradition. On the other hand, in Zagreb, no tradition, unfortunately. Within linguistics, I can only talk about this program, the PhD program. I mean, we just had one subject related to semiotics, no word, no connection to zoosemiotics at all. So that's why I'm especially grateful for your lecture today, to your talk. And then if I may say something, if I can share, that would not be a question, but then just to share my opinion, because while you were talking, I was thinking about my research I had, and then my research was on wild animals and how are wild animals associated. I mean, the perception of wild animals in the through the language, in Croatian, German, and Russian. I mean, the native speakers of Croatian, German, and Russians. And then I'm not familiar in the methodology you have or you had. You mentioned interviews, right? And the qualitative analysis. Okay, and then the idea. I mean, something that came across my mind was while you were talking about the interviews, I mean, the research with keepers, there would be something that would be interesting from my perspective, and that's the language of keepers. For example, in my research, and then I had monkeys, apes at all in language, and then you have all the swear words. Among all wild animals, you don't find wild animals in the language, or rarely you find them in the in phrases or in swear words, but you find apes, and you find domestic animals, and then you find apes. And it would be interesting, and those are all stereotypes that we have. And then it would be interesting if in the language of the keepers, you find all those swear words where you have apes, since they have that direct contact. And that would be a linguistic research that would be extremely interesting among keepers who have direct contact to apes. If you have that, and then what I suggest is that you don't find all those stereotypes towards apes in those swear words in the language of the keepers. And that would be something that your research would be then reflected on language. I mean, then from your sphere, zoosemiotics on language. That would be extremely, extremely then interesting. So sorry if this, what I shared, was too long and maybe messy or confusing,
No,
but
no, no.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Actually, this is something that I was very interested in myself. Before studying semiotics, I was into the field of linguistics, so it's definitely something that I'm interested in. And there was one specific reason why I could not do any of this work at this stage. Well, first of all, the aim of my study was different, but when I wanted to include linguistic elements, I was limited by the collection of data process that I had to use, because I'm not fluent neither in Russian or Estonian. I could not interview keepers in their native language. And I had to have a translator with me that would interview keepers, and a lot of the information about gender, for example, and about all these linguistic elements was lost in translation. There is also another very strong problem with using Estonian, because I was very interested in studying gender differences as well, how, for example, gender ideas would influence keepers' relationship with the animals, because they do have two females and they had at least one male chimp. And while I could see some hypothetical elements there, I could not access the language, and even if I wanted to use the direct transcript, I could not infer gender differences, because Estonia does not have genders, neither grammatically nor even pronouns. They only have a neutral one for he and she. So it was impossible for me to infer anything of that sort. But it was something that I was very interested in. And Russian had the exact opposite, because they have gendered words. So sometimes they would use a female gender for all the apes, because ape is feminine. It was something interesting, but unfortunately I could not do at this stage. Any other questions? You can also write in the chat if you feel more comfortable writing rather than talking.
Okay. Well, if there are no other questions, I would like to thank everyone who joined in and everyone who participated in the discussion. Thanks to Mirko. And the recording of this Zoom talk and meeting will be on the Facebook and YouTube channel of the Institute of Ethnology and Folklore Research. So I hope many more people will see. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day and have a good day.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm very happy to have had the chance to talk about my interests, and I hope you have a nice day.
Thank you, Mirko.
Bye.
Goodbye, everyone.